while the warriors rode out beneath banners and battle cries. Another kind of strength remained behind, quieter, but just as enduring. This story is about the women who stayed, the wives, daughters, and mothers who kept the hearth warm and the silence bearable. In this gentle walk through history, we'll follow their daily lives, marked not by conquest, but by quiet routine, quiet hope, and the slow passage of seasons. You're here, and I'm so glad you are. This corner of time, tucked far away from noise and haste, might be just what you've been needing. Before we settle too deep into soft candlelight and distant footfalls, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you find your breath slowing with the rhythm of it all. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what hour it is as the world quiets around you. There's something comforting about sharing this stillness across oceans and clocks. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe crack a window for that soft hush of wind, and let the weight of the day slip away. You're safe here, and tonight we'll walk gently through the lives of those who waited and endured. The road was never truly silent, just muffled by distance and dust. Hooves faded like the last notes of a song no one quite liked, but had learned to hum anyway. The men were gone, off to war or what passed for it. A lot of waiting, a little marching, and a generous helping of infection. Back home, silence settled in like a guest who never really announced themselves, not the soft, sacred kind poets wrote about. No. This was the sort of silence that crept under doors and pressed itself into the corners. A heavy quiet, padded by the absence of shouting, clanking, and the occasional man trying to flirt with a deadpan joke about wheat yields. There had been no grand farewells, just boots laced, heads bowed, and a few awkward pats on the shoulder, as if physical affection might undo centuries of male emotional repression. A kiss on the cheek, a whispered promise to return, a general mutual understanding that such promises meant very little. And then, nothing. Just the day continuing as if it didn't notice half the population had walked off into possible oblivion. The women turned back toward their homes, already bracing for the shift. The chores didn't pause for melancholy. The livestock in particular remained heroically indifferent to the geopolitical crisis. A cow needs milking whether your husband has gone to war or just gone to find himself. And so began the quiet logistics of survival. The first order of business was always the livestock, because if there was one constant truth in medieval life, it was that animals never cared about your emotional arc. Goats still escaped, chickens still plotted insurrection, and the pigs remained, as always, unsettlingly intelligent. Many women had never handled this part of life alone before. Their hands, more used to mending than managing, were suddenly expected to wrestle feed sacks, untangle harnesses, and carry water buckets. Like a CrossFit champion in homespun linen, they learned fast. Necessity has a way of steamrolling modesty, and one finds out rather quickly that a wool skirt makes a decent sling when a sheep decides to throw a tantrum halfway across a muddy field. But while the hands worked, the mind wandered. There were bills, of course, not the modern kind, with due dates and passive-aggressive font choices, but the medieval version, tithes to the church, grain owed to the Lord, debts paid in chickens or promises, or the occasional sack of mysteriously damp flour. One might say the church was running a very successful subscription model before capitalism got the memo. With the men gone, these duties fell to the women. They became accountants without parchment, negotiators without power, and managers of estates held together by spit, soot, and whatever god was listening that day. Some succeeded with quiet dignity, others simply developed a deep fondness for passive resistance, offering just enough obedience to avoid punishment, and just enough delay to confuse the system. Still, there was no training for this, no guidebook titled "So Your Husband Went to War and Left You with a Disgruntled Cow and 4 Questionable Neighbours." There were no TikToks on medieval war widow life hacks, no support forums, just routine and an eerie amount of candlelight. And the loneliness, of course, not the tragic, sweeping kind with violins in the background, but the slow, grainy kind that sticks to the back of your throat like ash. You miss the voice you used to argue with about nothing, the hands that always tied the door latch wrong, the smell of someone who hadn't bathed properly in weeks, but still felt like home. He took the sword. She took everything else. And in the space he left behind, inside that quiet, inside that emptiness, something else would grow. Not drama, not greatness, just competence. Q. Wet, irritated, mildly resentful competence, which in its own way was a kind of heroism too. The days rolled on, as they always did. Unconcerned with emotional recovery or dramatic pacing, they arrived every morning like a sheep at your door, muddy, insistent, and utterly indifferent to your plans. With the men still gone and the livestock mostly compliant, attention shifted to that eternal medieval ritual, laundry. Modern imaginations might conjure up a charming pastoral scene, sunlit streams, women laughing, linens fluttering like doves. Reality, as usual, was significantly damper and smelled faintly of boiled socks. Laundry in the medieval world was not a solitary task. It was a group event, a social obligation, a gossip exchange cleverly disguised as domestic labor. You didn't just boil undergarments, you boiled entire storylines, rehashed rumors, stirred suspicions. The clothes got cleaner, the reputations less so. Linen, if you were lucky. Burlap, if your husband had poor taste and a deep misunderstanding of chafing. Wool, reserved for nobility and their inexplicably warm thighs. Whatever the fabric, it was all soaked in lye, then pounded, scrubbed, and laid out like weary soldiers, defeated, steaming, and slightly misshapen. Laundry day was the medieval equivalent of a group chat, except you couldn't mute anyone, and everyone spoke in suspiciously vague parables. Women traded more than soap. Dreams were dissected, letters half-remembered were repeated with full confidence, and predictions about pregnancies flew like poorly aimed arrows. Someone's cousin had been pale lately, another's waistline was suspiciously expansive. Never mind that bread was scarce and salt retention wasn't yet a known science. If your ankles swelled in spring, congratulations, you were now the village subplot. There was comfort in the routine, something meditative about the repetition of movement, the scald of water on cold mornings, the soft hiss of steam rising like ghosts from the sea. Opera basin. Hands moved instinctively, while minds wandered to other things, husbands, hunger, harvests, and of course the increasingly imaginative possibilities surrounding who had been seen entering whose cottage after dusk. It was understood that truth mattered less than tone. A well-timed eyebrow raise could undo a person more effectively than any official decree. No one bathed daily, but the community was somehow pristine in its judgment. And beneath the chatter, always, the quiet ache of waiting. The women rarely said it aloud, but it hung between them like damp laundry. The fear that someone's husband wouldn't return, or would, but altered, or worse, perfectly the same, but with new complaints about stew, consistency, and missing boots. Still, the gossip helped. It filled the air, kept the silence from settling too deeply. It gave shape to uncertainty, like drawing faces in fog. Even if most of it was baseless, and some of it was barely coherent, it gave the illusion of control, of knowing something, of deciding something. There were, of course, unspoken rules. You could mention someone's slow stitching, but not her absent husband. You could speculate about a flirtation, but never say the word widow until it arrived with a priest. The line between comfort and cruelty was thin, and most women tiptoed it with expert precision. At the end of the day, the clothes were hung, the rumours were folded neatly, and the women returned to homes that felt slightly lighter, for the burden shared. And though their hands were cracked from lie and their backs ached from lifting more than anyone should without the promise of at least a mediocre gym playlist, they carried on, because the laundry never stopped, and neither did the need to know what everyone else was definitely not saying. The laundry dried, the rumours settled, and the days shifted forward like reluctant oxen, slow, stubborn, and mostly fueled by routine. With clothing scrubbed and gossip rinsed, the women turned back to a quieter sort of labour, the kind that happened with still hands and spiralling minds. Spinning, thread, not drama, although, depending on the village and the company, the two were often indistinguishable. Flax was the usual material, though wool made a seasonal appearance, and hemp, ever the overachiever, stayed reliable year-round. The process was deceptively simple. Take raw fibre, twist it through the fingers, and feed it through a spindle until it became usable thread. Repeat endlessly until either the basket was full or your soul quietly floated out of your body from the sheer monotony. And yet, it was soothing. There was a rhythm to it, a whispery hum as the wheel turned, the thread stretched, and the world around narrowed into manageable fibres. But where the hands focused, the mind wandered. This was where the real weaving happened, not in the skeins, but in the space between thought and thread. Worries were pulled like knots from the belly, small fears were combed through, hopes were looped and tied and knotted again, sometimes into intricate daydreams featuring the neighbour's strong-shouldered son, offering help with firewood, very innocently of course, completely respectable, helpful even, a pillar of the community, with forearms that hinted but never confirmed. It wasn't disloyalty, it was just narrative enrichment. In villages with no novels, limited parchment, and a shocking lack of plot twists, imagination did most of the heavy lifting. A passing glance at the market could be spun into an epic tale of forbidden love, tragic destiny, and someone tragically dropping a radish at exactly the wrong moment. There were rules, of course, unspoken, but ironclad. You could fantasize but not linger. You could sigh once, quietly, but anything louder earned a look. Entire affairs took place entirely within one's head and were discarded with the same practicality used for trimming uneven hems. And anyway, no one had the time or energy for actual scandal. Thread waited for no woman, and goats were always planning something. Sometimes fantasies didn't involve people at all. Sometimes they were just quiet visions of a different life. One with softer beds, warmer winters, and food that didn't require both fire and prayer to make edible. A life without blisters, or backaches, or that one smug, married woman who still had all her teeth and never missed a feast day. In these moments, the absurdity of it all surfaced. How women, expected to run households, birth children, and remember 30 feast days, were also required to do it in layers of wool, while maintaining a complexion that somehow pleased both men and saints. The fact that no one simply lay down and refused to participate remains one of history's quieter miracles. Some women embroidered while they spun, needles tracing delicate patterns into linen, flowers, stars, occasionally initials that didn't belong to their husbands, which was frowned upon but difficult to prove without accusing someone of being literate. Embroidery was its own language, a quiet rebellion sewn in silk. You couldn't say what you wanted, but you could stitch it into a handkerchief and pretend it was an accident. Accidental artistry with emotional baggage woven in. And so the thread continued, stretched across days and thoughts alike. Some of it became clothing, some bedding, and some quietly buried with the dead, wrapped around bodies that had once shared the same space, the same silence, the same soft weight of expectation. Not everything said aloud was true, but most of what was stitched probably was, because even if fidelity was largely honoured, the imagination was never celibate. By now the women had settled into a kind of reluctant rhythm, chores portioned across long days, gossip sprinkled like stale herbs, and spinning sessions layered with dreams and borderline scandalous embroidery. But if the adults were weary, the children were present, loudly. In the absence of half the village's workforce, every able-bodied soul was conscripted into domestic service, regardless of height, literacy, or basic hand-eye coordination. Children, being small, expendable, and constantly underfoot, were suddenly promoted to essential personnel. They stirred porridge, usually too fast. They fetched firewood, occasionally dragging more mud than timber. They held goats still with expressions of great suffering, as if being licked by a farm animal was a war crime, which, to be fair, it nearly was. There was no formal training. Instructions were given in grunts, gestures, and the unspoken language of "you'll figure it out" or "the barn burns down." And while a 6-year-old can technically churn butter and start a fire in the same hour, history suggests this wasn't always a winning combination. Still, they tried. Little fingers attempted sewing. Some ended up with neat hems, others with minor blood loss. Small feet carried water from the well, often sloshing half of it onto themselves along the way. But effort was rarely questioned, only results, and even those were negotiable if the goat didn't escape and the porridge was edible-ish. The chores taught skills, patience, balance. The precise moment when a chicken becomes angry and how far you can push it before it enacts vengeance. And unlike modern unpaid internships, these roles came with actual benefits, leftover crusts, an early bedtime, and the deep satisfaction of being trusted with a stick sharp enough to herd pigs. Education was a flexible concept. Reading was rare, writing even rarer. But lessons came anyway. Lessons about smoke and heat and why you never ever put the damp linen near the fire unless you enjoy explaining things to the village priest. In many households, the oldest girl became a miniature adult almost overnight, tasked with siblings, soup, and the emotional management of a household still slightly stunned by silence. She kept track of food stocks, of chores, of neighbours who didn't return borrowed things, which was basically proto-accounting minus the spreadsheet. Boys, on the other hand, were often handed farm tools and an optimistic nod. They grew strong from lifting things they barely understood, and by the age of 10 could usually build a fence, trap a rabbit, and pretend they hadn't broken the butter churn. Again, there were moments of play, too. Fleeting, chaotic bursts of childhood between chores, a game with pebbles, a race between hay piles, a stick transformed into a sword or a ladle, or, on very creative days, a baby dragon, and then someone would scream and someone else would cry, and a sheep would escape, and the whole system would reset itself by dinner. No TikTok, no tablets, just the thrill of surviving another day without losing a toe to frostbite or being trampled by a mildly irritated cow. The adults, of course, watched all this with the weary gaze of people who both appreciated the help and understood that everything just took a little longer when your workforce had sticky fingers and undeveloped motor skills. Still, children kept the house moving, kept it noisy, kept it from falling entirely into grief or stillness. They weren't saints, but they were useful. And in a world stitched together with threadbare routine and questionable porridge, usefulness counted for more than anyone let on. By the 5th week of rationed bread and suspiciously thin stew, hunger had ceased being an event. It was now just background noise, like the creak of the shutters or the soft, maddening cluck of a chicken that refused to lay eggs but wouldn't take a hint either. With the men still gone and the harvest reduced to whatever didn't rot in storage, cuisine had taken on a new and unfortunate personality, mostly beige, vaguely warm, and rarely identifiable. Bread was stretched so far with oats and dried peas it could probably qualify as a medieval yoga instructor. Still, feasts had to happen. Not for the sake of nourishment, of course, but for optics. If a visiting priest or an inquisitive neighbour arrived, it was unthinkable to offer just porridge and a sad stare. Hospitality meant illusion, a table filled enough to distract from the fact that the main course was turnip again, just rotated 90 degrees and renamed. The women became artists of deception. Dried herbs were fluffed. Onions were caramelized until they resembled something vaguely celebratory. Bread crusts were toasted twice to create texture, which was a polite word for crunchy regret. The trick was stretching what you had, not just flour, but the truth. A stew thickened with barley could pretend to contain meat, if you squinted and had a good imagination. A cabbage leaf could be layered, stuffed and baked until it vaguely resembled a delicacy, especially if no one asked too many questions. Salt was precious, butter rarer still, and meat was like your ex who left for war and never wrote back, fondly remembered, occasionally fantasized about, but definitely not around. When the village did get hold of a pig, it became a community event. Not so much a feast as a ritual. Every part was used, even the parts that, in modern kitchens, come with warning labels and require a signed waiver. Children were meant to gather nettles and bitter greens, which would be boiled into something that looked like soup, smelled like feet, and allegedly kept scurvy away. Whether it worked or just distracted you with cramps was never conclusively decided. Fasting days, dictated by both religion and resource scarcity, became strangely convenient. The church insisted on spiritual discipline. The villagers nodded, grateful they didn't have to invent another turnip-based recipe. Fish was allowed, technically, but only if one could afford it, catch it, or convincingly lie about it. There was a kind of competitive creativity in all this. One housewife became locally famous for making pies that were mostly crust and hope. Another devised a method of boiling beetroot so long it tasted like nothing, which, in these times, was considered a success. Presentation mattered too, not for flavour, but morale. A meal served on a clean wooden plate, beside a sprig of something vaguely green, could uplift spirits, for a few minutes at least, until someone tried to chew the garnish and realized it was decorative moss. Feasts became theatre, not sustenance, the illusion that things were normal, that visitors were welcome, that the village still had its dignity, even if the table had only 2 real potatoes and a third one carved from parsnip. And so the women leaned into the performance. They toasted with diluted wine and laughed a bit too loudly. They passed baskets that felt heavy, but were padded with cloth. They nodded proudly at the gruel, now labelled roasted grain stew with hints of wild garlic. Because in the Middle Ages, hunger wasn't a tragedy, it was just Tuesday, and making do with less, while pretending it was more, was as much a skill as weaving or prayer. After the turnip feast was cleared away and the children were scraped clean of barley mush, the women turned their attention, naturally, to self-improvement, or what passed for it in the Middle Ages. Even in a world with no mirrors, no Instagram, and no reliable soap, beauty mattered. Not because anyone expected a passing knight to gallop by and offer compliments, but because even in famine, even in war, vanity was strangely durable. You can starve with style. The ideal medieval face was pale, not fair, not peachy, pale, the kind of pallor that made you look freshly exhumed if the corpse had a title and land holdings. Achieving this look was an art form involving vinegar, chalk dust, and lead. Yes, lead. The same substance banned today for being slightly more toxic than arsenic, asbestos, and bad advice combined. But for noble women, poison wasn't a deal-breaker. It was part of the process. A white face signalled wealth, the privilege of never needing to toil under the sun, never mind the rashes, peeling, or occasional death. beauty has always demanded sacrifice. In this case, possibly your liver. Next came the forehead. In medieval Europe, the bigger, the better. A high forehead implied intelligence, nobility, and a complete absence of eyebrows. So, women plucked, not just brows, but hairlines. Entire front sections of scalp were removed, one root at a time, to give the illusion of a forehead so vast it could host a chess match and still have room for a sermon. Some women even shaved their temples and rubbed in vinegar to prevent regrowth. The goal was a dome of smooth, gleaming skin. The result was often something that resembled an overcooked egg with ambition. Lips were left pale. Rouge was dangerous, literally and reputationally. Red cheeks suggested lust or drunkenness, unless you were a duchess, in which case it was called complexion enhancement. Some used crushed beer. Rise. Others preferred mercury compounds, mercury, for the cheeks, on purpose, and still they smiled, or at least attempted to. Dental care in this era was, politely, theoretical. Toothpaste was made from ashes or salt or crushed bones. If you had more than 3 teeth in your 20s, you were either blessed or already betrothed to a bishop. Hair, too, had its moment. Long, shining locks were praised, but only when hidden. Married women were expected to cover their hair completely, because nothing says modesty like spending 3 hours oiling and braiding your hair, only to imprison it under 2 veils and a linen hood. Think of it like doing full glam makeup for a Zoom call with your camera off. Perfume? Not quite. Scented herbs were pinned into sleeves and bodices to mask the less floral realities of medieval hygiene. Bathing was sporadic. Deodorant, a fantasy. Most women smelled faintly of smoke, cabbage, and whatever animal they'd last carried. And yet the beauty rituals continued, not because they made logical sense, but because they were customs, expectations. The slow, communal madness of trying to live up to ideals invented by monks who thought elbows were erotic. In a world where you could die from childbirth, infection, or looking at the wrong priest the wrong way, beauty was oddly defiant, a quiet, toxic form of rebellion, a way to say I'm still here, still dignified, still plucking hair from my temples because someone, somewhere, said it made me worthy, because even in a village half-starved, buried under chores and drowning in soup made from dandelions, the women found time to smear chalk on their cheeks and widen their foreheads to supernatural proportions, all in the name of grace, or gossip prevention, or perhaps just tradition with a side of mercury poisoning. The paint on her face has faded, the vinegar has dried, the beauty rituals are paused, not because the standards have changed, but because time has passed. Too much of it, perhaps. Enough for doubt to bloom, like mould in the corner of the cottage. It has been months, maybe longer. The calendar is more idea than object. Days marked not by ink or parchment, but by bread loaves gone stale, chickens gone broody, and the slow fraying of hope along the hem of a gown, mended too many times. No word from the front, no news from the camp, no sign of whether her husband is a living man or a noble skeleton reclining in some foreign field. In modern life, uncertainty is a glitch, a lack of Wi-Fi, an unanswered text that triggers 3 follow-ups and mild panic. But here, in the slow ache of the medieval countryside, uncertainty is a way of life. Women learned early. The only thing less reliable than a messenger was the man he was sent to find. A letter might come, and if it does, it will arrive water-stained and half-legible, carried in the hands of a boy who doesn't know how to read. The ink will be smudged, the handwriting suspiciously neat, as if the scribe took more pride in penmanship than accuracy. All is well, the letter might say, which in translation could mean I still breathe, or they told me to say that. There is no return address, no reply. just the eerie quiet of having no way to confirm if your husband is dead, missing, or merely bad at writing. Ghosting, medieval edition. And yet, life continues. The goats still need herding. The baby still needs to be shushed. The soup still needs to be diluted with lies about flavour. Women patched shirts that might never be worn again. Sewed buttons onto tunics that may already be buried under 6 feet of someone else's war. They mended and scrubbed and waited. And in the gaps between chores, they imagined, not because they wanted to, but because silence insists upon it. Imagination for these women wasn't a luxury. It was survival. You had to invent a reason he hadn't written. Maybe he was promoted. Maybe he found a better pen. Maybe he lost both hands and is trying to learn quill writing with his feet. Anything but the likely truth. The church, of course, offered counsel, patience, prayer, penance, as if praying harder could change the logistics of mail delivery through a battlefield. Still, they prayed, mostly for news, even bad news, because bad news ends the waiting. It closes the chapter. Ambiguity, on the other hand, lingers like smoke in a wool cloak. You carry it with you. Some women lied. Yes, he wrote last week, they'd say, to curious neighbours or suspicious mothers-in-law. They said it with a confident nod, even as their hands trembled folding the same old shirts. Sometimes pretending he was alive felt easier than admitting they didn't know, because not knowing is a heavy thing to carry, like grief but without the closure, like widowhood but without the sympathy casseroles. And still the village moved on. Laundry was done, bread was baked, chickens chased worms with the enthusiasm of the willfully ignorant. Life, in its annoying consistency, refused to pause for the emotionally unstable. There is a quiet heroism in the waiting, in the routine, in continuing to fix the roof even though no one's sure who'll sleep beneath it. Hope is not always bright or brave. Sometimes it's just a hand stitching a sleeve for a man who may never wear it. But you sew anyway. You hang the herbs. You stir the soup. And you wait. Because sometimes the only reply is silence. And sometimes you answer it anyway, with a folded tunic, warm bread, and one more whispered lie. The feast day arrives quietly, not with trumpets or the clamour of returning feet, but with the soft, dutiful rhythm of preparation. A goose is plucked, a crust is cut. Herbs are crushed beneath hands that once clutched letters now folded away. It is a holiday, yes, but not one that bursts with celebration. This is the kind of holiday that remembers. In the village square, ribbons are tied. A garland of ivy sags slightly on one side. Like it, too, is tired. Women sweep dust from stones while pretending not to notice the way their brooms hesitate near the empty corners. Those invisible outlines of men who used to stand there, mug in hand, grin too wide, story too long. The music starts. Of course it does. A fiddler tunes a single reluctant string, while the drummer, 12 and dramatic, keeps time with the seriousness of a court scribe. People gather slowly, as if unsure whether joy is still allowed or merely rented by the hour. There are pies, though most are more ambition than filling. Bread is broken and passed around like gossip, warm, uneven, slightly undercooked, and still appreciated. Wine is poured, and while no one says it aloud, everyone quietly agrees not to ask where it came from or how watered down it may be. Today is not about honesty. It's about coping in style. Every chair holds a presence, not a person exactly, but a weight, an echo, a memory dressed in yesterday's tunic. They are not ghosts. Ghosts are flashy. These are quieter, shadows with names that no one speaks too loudly, lest the wind overhear and get ideas. Still, women dance, not in wild abandon, but in gentle sways, the kind of motion that doesn't disturb the sorrow lodged just behind the ribs. They move like candles, slow, flickering, stubborn. Children chase each other between skirts, shrieking with sugar highs and oblivious joy, while the mothers nod along as if their own laughter hasn't felt like theft lately. It's easy, in moments like this, to forget that this was once a holy day, or still is, a saint's feast, a martyr's bones under a distant altar. But here, it's more of a survival ritual, not so different really from a modern birthday party held 2 weeks late with a half-deflated balloon and a guest list of whoever didn't cancel. You show up, you eat what's available, and you smile, because the alternative is weeping into boiled carrots. The priest offers a prayer, something generic and multi-purpose. It blesses the bread, the weather, the village, and, vaguely, the absent. Not by name, that would be too sharp, too real. Names pierce, pronouns blur, and everyone prefers the blur today. One woman brings out a lute, and it sounds exactly like you'd expect an overused medieval lute to sound. Apologetic, twangy, trying its best. The music is neither happy nor sad. It simply exists, like dust or distant thunder, a background hum for a community pretending to be whole. Evening descends slowly. The sun lingers longer than usual, as if reluctant to leave them in the dark. Lanterns are lit. Not many. Oil is rationed, but enough to pretend that hope is still funded. The feast dwindles. Plates are scraped clean, not from hunger, but from habit. No one wastes food when futures are uncertain. Even the burnt crust is eaten, with the resigned dignity of someone chewing on both bread and grief. By nightfall the square empties. The music fades. Children sleep with smudged cheeks and sticky fingers. Women carry home blankets that smell faintly of wine and candle smoke. Nothing extravagant happened, but something mattered. Survival is a quiet thing, not the stuff of songs or stories. But it is, in its own stubborn way, a celebration, even when half the chairs are empty, even when half the heart is, too, because joy like soup was often thin, but still served. There is a kind of grief that doesn't knock, it doesn't wail or clutch its chest, it just moves in quietly, borrowing your spoons and rearranging the shelves. That's the kind of mourning most medieval women knew best, not a single thunderclap of bad news, but the long grey drizzle of nothing. First come the whispers. Have you heard from him? Maybe he's with the Duke's men now. Someone saw someone who said he passed through Norwich last winter. The news is always second-hand, and usually third-rate. In a world without reliable maps, let alone tracking numbers, every man gone to war was both a potential hero and a hypothetical corpse, and until bones or boots were confirmed, life hung in a very inconvenient in-between. The waiting begins innocently, an extra bowl at supper, a clean tunic kept folded, but months stretch, seasons change. Eventually the firewood is chopped for one, not two, and the bedding, once wide with hope, becomes something narrower, just enough for one tired body and a restless mind. The church had opinions, of course. The church always had opinions, 7 years. That was the sacred metric. If your husband disappeared and you hadn't heard a word in 7 winters, congratulations. You were finally allowed to consider yourself a widow, unless you walked through the door on day 2161, in which case your remarriage was suddenly very awkward, and possibly a sin, or bigamy, depending on which monk you asked. But the real problem wasn't theological, it was logistical. Fields didn't plough themselves, children didn't stay small, and inheritance laws, those were less laws and more a chaotic bingo game hosted by a drunk uncle. If a man had gone missing and you didn't remarry, the land might revert to his brother, or his lord, or the church, or whoever had enough parchment and confidence to say it should. So women adapted, slowly, quietly. One day she said, Tops setting out 2 cups. Another, she moves his boots into the corner. Eventually, the boots are gone, and someone else's are there instead. Remarriage wasn't always romantic. It was often practical, like switching out a missing puzzle piece with something that mostly fits, and hoping no one looks too closely. A neighbouring farmer, a widower with 3 goats and half a smile, someone with hands that could carry hay, not necessarily a heart full of poetry, which, to be fair, was still better than most dating apps. And for those who didn't remarry, whether by choice, stubbornness, or sheer exhaustion, there was still the problem of title. Widowhood had rules. You could be pitied, but only in a certain window. Too soon and you were scandalous. Too late, and people started calling you eccentric behind your back, or worse, useful. Women without husbands became the village's unofficial workforce. Need a midwife, a scribe, someone who knows how to stretch soup for 12? Ask a widow. She's been multitasking grief and survival since before the snow melted. Of course, sometimes the husband did return, changed, quiet, not quite a ghost, but close enough. He came home with new scars, new silences, and the distant smell of campfire ash baked into his skin. And then there were the legal questions. Did the remarriage count? Was the child still legitimate? Could 2 people learn to live together again after becoming strangers? In most cases, the answer was awkwardly. So the waiting never truly ended. Not after 7 years, not after 10. Because even if the body didn't come back, the memory lingered. It was there in the turn of a doorknob, the shape of a child's nose, the way winter crept in through the same cracks he used to fix. And in the end, grief wasn't loud. It was a folded letter, an extra cup never used, a name that slipped out once in a dream and never again. Because in the medieval world, love might last forever, but property disputes, those were immortal. The road to the village is always dusty, or muddy, or frozen, but mostly it's empty. For years, that emptiness became routine. Children stopped glancing up at the sound of distant hooves. Dogs stopped barking at strangers, and the woman who waited, she adjusted to silence the way people adjust to drafty windows or itchy wool, slowly and with mild resentment. And then one day, maybe, there's a shape on the path. It might be a traveller, a farmer, a peddler who smells like onions and regret, or perhaps, after all these years, it's him. The man who once kissed her with young hands and left with a sword he didn't quite know how to hold. He's older now, thinner, a little bent in the spine, like a book left too long in the sun. But let's not get too romantic, because the truth is, even if it is him, it isn't him. He returns to the same house, but the fire is no longer where it was. The bed leans differently. The herbs hang in new clusters. His favourite chair has been quietly repurposed into a drying rack. And the woman? She doesn't just look older, she feels like someone who had to memorize every cracked beam of this house alone. This is the part they never tell you in war stories. That peace is not a trumpet fanfare or a joyful reunion in slow motion. It's boots at the door that don't quite sound the same. It's a bowl placed out of habit and then remembered. Because while he was away storming castles or marching behind a banner, she was storming laundry lines, ploughing fields, and negotiating with neighbours who acted like taxes were a matter of personal vengeance. He comes back with scars and stories. She comes back with skills. He might speak of battles, but she's been waging a quieter war against mildew, grief, and the social labyrinth of church feasts. Honestly, she deserves a knighthood, or at least a hot bath and some uninterrupted silence. But here's the real problem. T, the woman who waited, no longer fits the shape of waiting. Time didn't stop for her. It didn't even slow down. While he was frozen in memory, she moved forward in 100 little ways, each one invisible until he stepped into the doorway and noticed the air felt different. And if he didn't return? Well, some men come back only as rumours, as a name carved into the church wall, as the cause of a land dispute no one wants to solve. In that case, she still hears footsteps, but only in memory. And memory is unreliable. It wears a bit thin, like old linen. Eventually, Even the sharpest images soften at the edges. So whether he came back in flesh or just in thought, the result is strangely the same. The door opens and something is gone. Either a ghost is finally let in or finally let go. There is no celebration, no dramatic reunion. Just two people, once familiar, now relearning how to be near each other without flinching. Or one woman and a quiet home learning how to make peace with the empty space that used to be full of hope. Because in the end, war isn't just battles and banners, it's the slow erosion of habits, of shared jokes, of knowing where someone's shoes will be. He left with a sword. She kept the village alive. And when the door creaks open, it doesn't matter who walks in. What matters is that she still stands, still waits, even if waiting no longer means hoping, just listening for boots or the memory of them.